coming along today, and a special hello to all of you tuning in from cyberspace. My name's Jamie Boyd. I'm a senior web interface developer at Equator here in Glasgow, and I'd like to talk to you today a bit about social media, a bit about content, and a bit about some recent work we've been doing to kind of reconcile the two. Let's talk about social media first of all. One aspect of social media that I find really interesting is the notion of social objects, the tangible things that we share online, photos, videos, posts, updates, tweets. The objects which we share and then form social interactions around online. And I think it's all very interesting when as part of my job, I spend a lot of time looking at websites, and something I find really interesting with social networking services in particular is how they treat social objects. I think the success or otherwise of these services can depend a lot on this. And I think a common feature for the successful services is that they make social objects as shareable as possible, and principal way they do this is by using the web as the universal medium for the sharing. There are lots of good examples, but a particular favourite of mine, a recent success, is Instagram, the photo sharing service. Now, at first glance, this doesn't look like a particularly web-focused service. It's app-based and it's limited to the iPhone. If you go to instagr.am, what you're confronted with is simply a landing page which tells you to go to the App Store and download the app. So at first glance, there's nothing particularly web-based about it. But in fact, the web portion of Instagram is actually, I would argue, the most important part, because whenever you take a picture and upload it to Instagram, Instagram creates one of these. It's a link. And it's a unique link, and it's a permanent link, and it's what allows Instagram to be shared so widely. So if I'm looking at Facebook, for instance, and a friend of mine has taken a picture, uploaded it to Instagram, and through the inbuilt configuration settings has shared that on Facebook, I click on that sitting at my desk, I'm going to see this, which is a desktop optimized view of the picture, bit of information, perhaps some geolocation information. I didn't actually geotag this particular photo. If I'm checking out Facebook on my phone and I click the same link, I'm presented with this, a mobile optimized view of the same picture. So the big successful social networking services all do this. They will allow you to share anything from anywhere to anywhere, and will generally optimize it for whatever kind of device you're looking at. And this kind of begs the question, if you are a content creator, does your content respond in the same way to the user's context? Now you may say, well, I'm not running a social network service, but the fact is that as new devices emerge, as we've seen the explosion in powerful mobile devices, these social networking services are setting the precedent and setting expectations about how content, social objects are shared online. So we need, whatever kind of content we're creating online, we need to respond to these expectations. People are no longer satisfied with looking at a piece of content on their phone, seeing a desktop site that's been crammed into a tiny space, and thinking this. They're simply thinking that that site's broken, that's no good. And paradoxically, as we've seen the rise in powerful mobile computing devices, paradoxically, this idea of the mobile web is going away as a result. People aren't thinking in terms of mobile web anymore. Users certainly aren't. There are two kinds of web nowadays. There's the web that works and the web that doesn't. And people aren't creating any more distinctions than that. And as content creators, something else that's happened that we need to be mindful of is that these new devices have kind of erased what we had kind of relied on in the past, comfortable stereotypes about the way people use devices. You know, the classic example of the mobile user who's in a hurry, who's running down the street, who wants to do simple things. These stereotypes just aren't true anymore. People are using any device to do just about anything. So where does this leave us as content creators? Well, there's no getting around the fact that we are now living in a much more complex world, and we need to get a handle on that. We need to find a way to approach that and to deliver effective services in spite of this complexity. So I would suggest a way to approach this is to let go of some of the control we've had over web experiences in the past and embrace what is a fundamental aspect of the web and always has been, and the fact that it can be flexible and that we need to be flexible in kind. So we now have the tools to create single websites or single web services which are flexible enough to respond to users' context and to deliver content to them in an optimized way, to meet them halfway. The whole web, this person has decided to spend their time and attention on your particular content. So I think meeting them halfway is really the least we can do. How do we be flexible? How can we meet users halfway? I would suggest responsive web design as a potential solution to this. Responsive web design has not been around long. It was kind of conceived of by this guy Ethan Marcotte, who's a Boston-based web developer, and he kind of laid out his thinking in this article, which was first published on the web magazine A List Apart in May last year. Now, in that original article, Ethan was quite specific about what he meant by responsive web design. To him, it is a set of specific techniques and tools that allows a website's layout to respond to the device it's being displayed on. So what that means is the same website appearing on a desktop display, on a medium-sized tablet display, on a mobile display, can reconfigure itself in sometimes quite radical ways to provide an optimum viewing experience for the user. In this article, Ethan laid out three techniques which make up responsive web design. The first one is the idea of fluid grids. So rather than fixed width websites, websites which will contract and expand as the display contracts and expands. The second element to responsive web design are flexible images. So as this fluid grid contracts and expands, images within it scale appropriately and don't break out of the grid. Now, these two elements are not really new. Flexible grids have been around, as long as the web. Flexible images for quite a while, the ability to make images scale correctly. But the third element, which is a somewhat more recent development, kind of was the special sauce that kind of Ethan took and mixed together with the first two and created something which is really a kind of greater than the sum of the parts. And this is CSS media queries. Now, CSS is the language that is used to create layout, create appearance on a website. And media queries are a way of using specific pieces of CSS under certain circumstances. So as the screen size changes, the page contents can reconfigure because we're using different parts of the CSS to lay out the page in different ways. And the goal being to provide an optimum layout. So this is fairly new. It's been around just over a year. And for the past year, Equator, who I work for, have been working with McDonald Hotels, who are a large chain of hotels in the UK and with some abroad. They own and manage 45 hotels in the UK. So for the past year, we've been working them on redeveloping their website and redeveloping a lot of the back-end systems which they use to manage their online booking system. And part of their original brief was two parts of the brief were that they wanted some way to respond to mobile users. And the second part is that they were engaging more with social media and wanted to incorporate aspects of that in the new website design. So we thought responsive web design would be a good approach to take with this. So I'm going to skip back. I'm going to show you what we did first of all, briefly, and then explain a bit about how we did it. So I'll just click this to stop scrolling. Okay, so this is the new McDonald's website. It went live on Wednesday. The timing is impeccable for this talk. And so what we have here is, it's interesting because this screen is quite a low resolution, so we're kind of we're being responsive already. So basically what this site does is as the display changes, the screen reconfigures, or the page reconfigures itself to provide an optimum layout. So you can see here we're a reasonably big screen size. So we've got the traditional kind of main navigation. This booking component here is found across the whole site. And then further down we have, this is the home page, further down we have a kind of banner scroller, and then further down we have some more feature components, and then a kind of big fat footer at the bottom full of kind of useful links. So this is kind of a smallish desktop view of the site. But if I start reducing the screen size, you'll see some things happening. So first of all, up here, you can see content is flowing to fit with the fluid grid, and further down you'll see the images in these kind of two scroller components are scaling as well. Now, once we get down to kind of display sizes for typical mobile devices, we see something a bit more radical happening. So what's happened is a media query has kicked in and said, okay, we're going to stop using the CSS that's specific to a kind of desktop layout. We're going to bring in the mobile specific CSS. And so what we see happening is the main navigation here as, oh, is this, damn it. I'll just point. So the main navigation and the booking component have kind of shrunk down into kind of show hide components. And then further down, the main feature scroller has been reduced in size, and what was originally a horizontal scroller has kind of turned into just a vertical stack of content. And then further down, the footer links and so on have kind of stacked on top of each other, and we've got a generally linear layout. So skip back to this. So here's some I prepared earlier. So this is the kind of greater than about 960 pixels layout. So we've got the main navigation in a nice line. We've got the booking component on a single row. Typical desktop layout. So as we narrow down again, maybe to a kind of tablet kind of scale, we've got the content flowing. We've got some changes, and then from the mobile experience, we've got a much more compact layout, and so typo, excellent. No, we'll not bother fixing it. So how did we approach this? Well, we started with a solid foundation, and you know, as in common with what most websites you start with, we started with good web standards and progressive enhancement. So web standards, clean semantic markup, best practice accessibility, things like that. And then progressive enhancement, building basic functionality which can then be enhanced using more advanced technologies like CSS3 and JavaScript. And we hope that responsive design would kind of form a fairly natural third part to this. So I'd like to talk about 5 things that we learned as part of this project. It's a few different things, some development stuff, some general process stuff, some design stuff. A bit of a mixed bag. Hopefully you'll get something useful, take something useful away somewhere. So, so number 1, first thing we learned, test on hardware as soon as possible. So we started off, our design team started off in kind of the usual manner. We knew we wanted to support a range of devices. So we started off, our design team started off creating some wireframes just to kind of look at the different ideas for the different layouts we wanted to use. And what we wanted to do was get these onto phones and tablets immediately. We wanted to see something, on the device. So that's what we did. Here, this is kind of version 1 of the homepage wireframe for the mobile layout. And as you can see, it's fairly straightforward linearization of all the content we wanted to have on the homepage. Kind of zoom in a bit. Here you can see the header. And so what we did was we created a simple web page whereby it was basically displaying this image on a page which would scale to the native resolution of, in this case, the mobile phone. So what we ended up with was something like this. And because it's the full image, we could scroll up and down and get actually a fairly good approximation of what it felt like. So some of the things this was incredibly useful in looking at was number 1, screen resolution. Most modern smartphones have screen resolutions which are much higher than typical desktop displays. The iPhone, for example, has about 66% higher screen resolution, which kind of equals out to about a 60% reduction in size of elements on the screen. So this is something we're kind of aware of, and we wanted to see something designed on desktop. How big did we need to go to get something that looked good on the mobile? So that then kind of led on to looking at content and controls like buttons and so on, and making sure they were optimized correctly. And we could, because we were able to look at stuff on the phone, we could very early on spot any problems. And I think besides this kind of more technical stuff, the really interesting thing was just getting a sense of how the site felt. You can resize a browser window on your desktop to the same size, but there is something fundamentally different at looking at something like this than sitting at a desk and looking at a big screen. And it was kind of intangible, but it was, we got a real sense of where we were going with the mobile and tablet optimizations, and it was quite exciting for one thing. So through this very early getting the simplest wireframes we could produce onto the devices, we gained some really fundamental design insights, which leads me on to point number 2, keeping the user orientated. So the McDonald's website is substantial. It has a lot of content, a lot of hotels with unique personalities and selling points that we wanted to kind of highlight. So there was a lot of content. It's a big site, so we were kind of wary of the fact that user journeys could be quite diverse, and there were quite a few of them. So we wanted to make sure that the user didn't get lost. I mean, it's a kind of fundamental aspect of any kind of size of website, any layout of website. But the small screen was giving us kind of concerns because the kind of affordances you can put on the page to show a user where they are limited because of the screen size. So so back to our version 1 wireframe. The first thing we noticed was that the main navigation and the booking component are going to be on virtually every page on the site. So if we have them in this arrangement, any page on the site is going to look the same when the user lands in it, which isn't good. So light bulb. So what we did was, as I showed you on the kind of live site, we created mobile-specific controls which shrunk down the menu and the booking component, and got content onto the page that identified what page it was. And here again, as it is in the final site. So learning one, kind of a no-brainer in retrospect, but that's why you have a design process. You discover these things, and luckily we discovered this very early on. So reduce the header, any constant content at the top of the page. Reduce it to the smallest size as possible, and get content on the page which will identify the page to the user when the page loads, so the user doesn't have to scroll at all. They should be able to tell where they are instantly. Right, number 3. This is a goodie. I will need a drink of water for this. So, as we kind of moved into the interface development phase, although we were working concurrently, but as interface development kind of ramped up, we had a look at the content, had a look at the sitemap, had a look at the site structure, and we kind of became a wee bit concerned about the complexity of what we were having to deal with in terms of laying components out on the grid, and at the same time dealing with multiple grids. So the complexity of a normal site was kind of increasing exponentially when we factored in all these different layouts that we wanted to do with media queries. So the complexity starts to ramp up quite a lot. So we needed to simplify things, and we were looking for ways to simplify things. And an idea we decided to kind of follow was that could we create a framework in CSS which would automatically lay out components on the grid, on the series of grids which we were creating. And so we wouldn't really have to worry about that. In terms of laying out components, this framework would do the heavy lifting for us. And then we could deal with kind of finessing content within components. And so I'll take you through an example of how we kind of solve this problem. This is a part of a page on the site. As you can see, we've got 3 columns with spacing in between, and we knew that because of the way we were building the content management system, there would be quite a bit of flexibility in terms of what components you could put on what page. So, a problem we wanted to solve was not having to worry about where a component was on the page. Essentially, from the grid's point of view, we wanted to make all components identical so that we could put a component anywhere and it would automatically align to the grid. So the way that we made all components identical was to kind of make them align themselves to the grid by using symmetrical spacing on either side. So we did this by setting CSS margins and making them symmetrical. So in this example, the margin on each side of each component is 1% of the total width. So this is 1%, the start band here is 1%. You've got 2% here with 1% from either component contributing to that. And making these components symmetrical means that we can take this component here and move it here. We can take this component here and move it here. The component does not care if it is first in a row, last in a row, or in the middle. And it doesn't care when the grid shifts to a new configuration, that position is likely to change. It won't care that it's changed position. So great. So simple solution. But of course, the world is not simple and far more exciting than that. And so we kind of ran into some issues with this approach. So this part of the page looks like 3 columns, 3 components. It's actually not. It's actually 2 components. We've got this single column offers component on the right-hand side. But then we've got this component here, which is currently 2 columns, but in other contexts in the site can be from 1 to 4 columns in width, and can have varying numbers of these subcomponents within it. So, we were kind of, so we had the same challenge, but on a kind of a smaller scale. So we needed to match up margins. So the component, which had a generic CSS class of component, had these margins set on the outside. So we just needed to worry about the margins in the middle here, which would be margins put on these subcomponents. But we have recreated the problem. In doing that, we've recreated the problem that we just solved, in that these subcomponents can't have symmetrical margins, and therefore they aren't going to be flexible in the way we need them to be. So we solved this by creating a special case for components which spread over multiple columns and contained subcomponents, in that the component, the 2-column component, doesn't have any margins on it. The inner subcomponents are the ones which the margins are set on. So in addition to this rule about having symmetrical margins on components, we added another rule, which was that you should put the margins on the smallest indivisible unit. So that could be a component, or it could be a subcomponent within that. How are we doing? Right, so great, we've solved the multi-column component problem. Almost. So for a fluid grid to work, you need to set the margins as percentages, proportional units which will scale with the rest of the grid. So as I said at the beginning, the margin we were looking for was 1% either side of each component. So, and this one has, this right-hand component has the 1%. Yeah, it's working again. But it's 1% of the total width. Now, the margins set to 1% on these subcomponents are 1% of the total width of this component here. So although the margins are both 1%, that's creating different absolute values in terms of pixels. So all these subcomponents don't line up. So a solution is a simple bit of maths. What we need to do is have a way of calculating margins that have different percentage values set, but they give identical pixel values. And the bit of maths we use for that is we take the outer container width, so the width of the 3 columns. We divide that by the inner component width, the 2-column width, and that gives us a multiplier. So I'll take you through this. So the outer container width, we'll give that value of 1. The inner component width, that needs to be 2/3. So 1 divided by 2/3 gives us this multiplying factor of 1.5. So if we take the original margin of the subcomponent, which was 1, multiply it by 1.5, we get a margin of 1.5%. We set margins of 1.5% on each of these subcomponents, and as if by magic, the margins match on the page. So, so this worked, and it was really, really good that we did it. I think we saved a lot of time, and the alternative of trying to deal with all the permutations of components in different configurations would have just been unthinkable, I think, in retrospect. So the two rules we had for creating this layout grid. So, like I said, keep the margins symmetrical and proportional, and set margins on the smallest indivisible units, and use this simple bit of maths to equal things out. Right. How are we doing? That was the science bit. And how are we doing? Oh, we're good. Okay, number 4. Use JavaScript to load optimized images. If we are, here's the McDonald's site, desktop and mobile. Now, the part of responsive web design that deals with flexible images is in some ways a wee bit too good. We can load an image that on the desktop, which in this case is 980 pixels wide by 270 high, and using CSS we can cram that scale that right down to this size here, which is about 320 pixels. So the same image can display on any device, but we're being a bit unfair to mobile users because we're loading an image that's 9 times bigger than it needs to be. And they're not going to thank us when they use up their data plan monthly bandwidth as a result. So we needed a way to load different sized images on different devices. But at the same time, we were kind of wary of loading a page and then going and fetching a whole load of images and loading these images in, and the kind of layout of the page then changes radically. If somebody is looking at a page trying to work out where they are, they don't need a load of stuff changing in front of their eyes. So we kind of came up with a compromise. What we did was we loaded low resolution versions on all devices. Oh dear. On all devices as a first step on page load. So skip back. In the case of this feature scroller component here, we loaded 100 pixel wide images, but because of the CSS media queries, this image and the flexible images, this image was scaled up to fit the space. So it was a low resolution looking image. It looked a bit crummy, but it was correctly proportioned. What we could then do after the page had loaded was detect the component size, and depending on what that was, load in optimized images asynchronously using Ajax. And load those in the background and then just switch them. And so how that looks on the screen is you see a low resolution image for half a second, and then it switches seamlessly to a high resolution image. And that was a good solution. And it was a good enough solution for our needs. Okay, last thing that we learned. This is kind of more of a general process point. Be agile, be prepared to improvise. So we've talked about the complexities of responsive design, and I think they are such that there's an awful lot that just cannot be anticipated when you start the process. So you need a process which has built-in discovery, and you can test things, you can prototype things, you can look for things you weren't expecting. and deal with those in a kind of agile way. An example of that would be in what are called the layout transition breakpoints. These are the points. These are the screen sizes where you switch from one display to another. And these are generally what you'll design the wireframes to. So, for example, a mobile breakpoint might be 480 pixels, which is the kind of landscape view on many smartphones. So you might design the mobile layout to fit that, or maybe the portrait view of that. But on the wrong side of those breakpoints, things can get a bit weird and layouts can get really stressed. So as I said, a breakpoint at 480 pixels that triggers the phone layout. 480 pixels, great, you've got a great phone layout. But what happens to the layout at 481 pixels? You're still on the medium-sized display layout, but you're really at a mobile screen size. And so you have to be careful about what's going on here. You have to look carefully because some really weird things happen with layout. So as we went through the interface development process, we were constantly looking at these breakpoints and seeing when we created a new component, we created the standard styles for the desktop, for tablet, for mobile. But then we kind of stressed these layouts. We took it down to just before the mobile and saw what was happening. And some weird things were happening in some cases. And so we had to deal with those. So what we did was on top of this first set of breakpoints, which we kind of had anticipated beforehand, we then added intermediate ones where we could add CSS to deal with these specific cases. So let's do a quick recap on these kind of 5 things. So number 1, test on hardware, vitally important. If you are with any kind of website or service you're building, if you're claiming to support a particular device, testing on it is just absolutely essential. There are no excuses for not doing that. And testing early, as I showed, can lead to some real insights right when you need them at the very beginning of the project. Number 2, keep the user orientated. Fundamental part of all websites, but particularly tricky to kind of do on the smaller mobile screens. Number 3, build a layout grid system to handle some of the layout for you. It was fairly complex to do, and there was a lot of discovery involved, but it really was a lifesaver in our case. Optimize images, be kind to people with data plans. And number 5, be agile and improvise. I mean, responsive web design is all about being flexible, being agile, and if you're developing websites that are responsive, you have to kind of respond in kind. The complexity is such that you really need to go into it expecting to discover an awful lot, and that has to be kind of factored into your project process. So we're rattling through this, got some time for questions, this is good. So a few final thoughts. We kind of approached this in a fairly pragmatic way. There were a lot of other constraints with the project in terms of the technology that we were required to build. So we kind of took a fairly pragmatic approach about this. For instance, we decided we were going to test on and support 2 devices, the iPad and the iPhone. And we weren't going to make any promises beyond that. But as it turns out, the basics of what we did, so doing good web standards, doing good progressive enhancement, and then building the responsive design on top of that really took us an awfully long way. I think something that surprised me was just how robust this is. I mean, I was saying about layouts going a bit squiggly when they got strained, but that was kind of the exception rather than the rule. Another key factor why we chose responsive design is that we had an awful lot of back-end development going on. We had some really complex data management, an awful lot of systems integration. There was a substantial amount of stuff going on. So we wanted to choose a way to provide optimized experiences on different devices that had as little impact on the back end as possible. So, for example, in our particular case, there is no server-side device detection going on. But as I said, even just using front-end media queries, it took us a long way. And so, as a result, there was virtually no impact whatsoever on back-end development. Something I think they appreciated. See what I've done. See what I've done. I'm going to fix this because this is kind of. Right. So responsive design is not a silver bullet for mobile strategy. Going back to Ethan Markot's original article, he was very clear about this. This is not solving the mobile question. This is not nirvana in terms of different devices. This is very specifically about a screen size strategy. So this is about different layouts on different screen sizes. Mobile strategy is much more than that. It's combining things like the kind of advanced technologies that we're seeing emerge with HTML5, like geolocation, things like that. It's about involves good information architecture. It involves good user experience design. It involves perhaps taking a mobile-first approach to design, where you focus on designing the experience on the mobile first, which then forces you to focus on what is important in the design. Responsive design, I think, is a fundamental part of a mobile strategy, though. Like I was saying before, the ecosystem we're living in now is too complex to kind of think about separate websites for different devices. And the idea of a M dot website or a dot mobi is kind of gone, because people expect much more. People expect the same content on whatever device they're using, and they're expecting that because, as I said before, there are people delivering that content across multiple devices. So yeah, it's not a silver bullet, but I think in our case, as I said, we took a pragmatic approach to this. In our case, it delivered what we needed it to deliver, with a surprising amount of robustness and capability. So I would suggest to you that responsive design is definitely something you should be thinking about if you're tackling any kind of web project moving forward. Being responsive is becoming essential when we deal with the web now. And like I said before, if you're not being responsive to your users' needs, you're not being put into some kind of category, a desktop category or tablet category or mobile. You're being put into the category of, well, that just doesn't work. So be responsive. Be responsive in the designs you create. Be responsive in the process of creating those designs. Embrace the flexibility that's inherent in the web, and really take this opportunity to build the web the way it was always meant to be. And on that note, I will say thank you for your attention. And do you have any questions? And I should say I have prepared a flexible and generic answer, which may suit your needs. But if not, we'll create some special cases and give you proper answers. So, anybody have a question or just want to discuss anything?
How do you think this sits with mobile or native apps? Do you think this may replace them or certain types?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this kind of debate about mobile websites or web apps versus native apps. I think they have their place. I think Instagram's a great example of that, where you're doing an awful lot of quite cool stuff with the camera on the iPhone, lots of filters, lots of tilt shifting, all these kind of cool effects, which are currently the domain of native apps. I think the idea that was kind of pervasive maybe a year or two ago that it was all going to go to apps, that's kind of dying off, I think. I mean, there was a bit of research that was published in this summer, which was they'd done a survey of, this company had done a survey of apps and found that 80% of brand-focused apps were downloaded less than 1,000 times each. So, it's not really viable anymore to create, an example, an app that, is a glass of beer that tilts as you tilt the phone. That just doesn't get any traction anymore. What people are looking for with apps are mature, task-focused pieces of software which can be used daily. I don't think the kind of approach of using an app to sell a brand takes you very far, unless it is doing something a bit more than here we are. The whole idea of fitting that into a kind of social network environment really doesn't work either. Like I was saying, the web addresses are the universal way of sharing things. You don't get a link to an app. At least if you do, it's a bit of a brick wall. Most people aren't interested in downloading an app to see something, they just want to see it. So I think in terms of sharing content, the web is the thing to do. In terms of creating software for dealing with tasks and for not particularly serious tasks, you don't have to be, but things that you use over and over again, that's the kind of, you should probably be thinking about a kind of native app in that case. But yeah, it depends, of course. It depends on the situation. It depends on your business case or your goals. Do
you not think that the native app stuff is only actually really useful when it's taking advantages of the feature of the phone? Because that's really that's why Instagram works, because you take pictures with the phone. It's the app is taking advantage of the phone's features. A task-related app that's collecting data and storing it somewhere, etc., could be easily done over a mobile-enabled website, for example, a responsive website. It doesn't need to be an app.
No.
I think it's the phones that benefit the native app, rather. I mean, is that something you would agree with or not?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, it does depend what you're trying to do. If you're doing, using social networking as an example, 50% of, I think it's about 50% or 55%, I think I read the figures out now, of activity on Twitter is through mobile devices. But the vast majority of that is through the website, the mobile optimized website. So, yeah, it does depend what you're doing. I mean, currently there's no denying that native apps can have far more capability in terms of leveraging phone or device features and doing kind of more computationally intensive things. But again, a lot of these native apps are, we see an app, a self-contained bit of software, but that's kind of really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the service. I suppose a way of looking at it is that these services are being responsive, but they're being responsive at a kind of higher level, so that they're not simply creating responsive web experiences or responsive websites. They're actually creating responsive platforms. So, you know, Twitter is a platform, and it's an API that you can use a mobile site with, you can use a native app with, you can use a number of native apps with, or you can use in other ways. You can pull in content, you can remix it, you can do all these different things. So I think if you're looking at, do we do a web app, do we do a native app, I think you need to consider that higher level and say, actually, first, do we need to build a platform? And moving ahead, we can then support whatever new technologies come along. There's a quote from Jeff Veen, who's a well-known developer, web developer, worked at Google and now works at Typekit. He said the first step in creating a website these days is really writing the documentation for the API, because that's almost expected now. You know, it's like we've done an awful lot of work with, you know, integrating these social networking services into the products we create for clients, and you know, we're in a dozen APIs, pulling in all sorts of different things, and that's the power of these networks, that they have thought one level up from the front end user experience and thought, okay, we need to build something flexible that is scalable in the future and is going to kind of anticipate all these unknown platforms which are eventually going to come along and we're going to be able to be on. Does that answer your question? That was good.
Did you spend much time in IE, and what was the strategy with kind of IE6?
We had a lovely client who allowed us to ignore IE6 altogether, which was great. But Internet Explorer was well, it wasn't an issue. There were Internet Explorer 9 supports media queries and has really good support for media queries, so it kind of behaved like the other browsers we were developing against, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, and then the kind of mobile Safari in our case. So we didn't really have a problem with that. IE8 and IE7 don't support media queries, so what we got was a site which was fluid, but would not reorientate itself, so it would just get squashed and squashed and squashed and squashed, and eventually become unusable. But again, we were being pragmatic, so we said, well, we're just going to make IE7 and IE8 full width, fixed width sites. And I mean, I was saying about the back end had minimal impact. Doing responsive web design had minimal impact on the back end. It actually has minimal impact on the front end as well, because turning this fluid site into a fixed width site for IE8 and IE7 was basically 2 lines of code, and that was it. And everything else was just, even IE8 and IE7 are good in that if there's something they don't understand, they ignore it. So that's all we needed to do. And again, this was really kind of the first project where we'd used responsive web design. It was a bit of a whopper for that, but we took comfort from the fact that if we got into difficulties with some part of it, and it was becoming too much of a risk, and we had to kind of jettison that part of the functionality. There's nothing to that. You just delete the media queries and that's it, and change a couple of things, and you've got a fixed width site. So we took a pragmatic approach, and we took a limited approach, and but despite the fact that legacy versions of IE didn't support responsive design to the fullest extent, they still made it easy to create alternatives. Anybody else? Got a few more minutes. So. Yep.
How did you find that approach affected the whole timescale of the project?
It's a good question. Well, of course, our project manager wanted to know up front what that answer was going to be. And so we kind of took an educated guess, and just kind of clicked a percentage on the overall kind of front end build scope, and it was about, it kind of fluctuated a bit as we had discussions, but it was between, we kind of took a bit of a stab in the dark and said between about 25 and 30% on top of the time. And early on, it was looking a wee bit small, and we were getting a bit worried. But actually, what we found was as we progressed, things got a lot easier. Once we got core functionality going, once we got this layout grid working, things sped up an awful lot. Well, like I said, the site went live on Wednesday, and that's when it was meant to go live. So we brought it in on time. So yeah, again, depending on what you need to support, depending on the hardware you're looking at, depending on the different devices. I think maybe 25 to 30% is a good place to start, and then tack this on at the end, depending on your individual circumstances. But, yeah.
For the IE678 solution, was it just a case of turning it into a fixed width site was so simple that you decided not to go down the route of, say, Respond.js to create media query polyfills, or? Yeah. I mean, we didn't want to again raise the risk in terms of what the site is doing, because in fact it's doing an awful lot with an awful lot of data, and we didn't want to, especially in kind of legacy browsers, we didn't want to pile a whole load of JavaScript on top. So we took this kind of very much this kind of approach of progressive enhancement. This is Jared, who was my co-front-end developer on the project. So
hi. Just to respond to some of those IE6 questions, one of the things we took, like Jamie said, we took a pragmatic approach, but it's more, I was sitting there developing and go, oh, IE6 doesn't quite catch it, and it's like, it doesn't have to catch it because IE6 isn't going to be on my mobile device. So we're looking at a device. It's a device solution, not a browser solution, which is where we have to forget, because I was sitting there going, oh God, when I'm in a mobile state, I can't use this particular CSS query because IE6 doesn't do it. And I go, I don't have to, because if it doesn't support media queries, then it doesn't support my CSS. So it allows you to be a lot more open and stick to actual web standards and say, if it doesn't support this thing, it won't support this thing either. So we're not actually supporting IE6. We are supporting devices, and that's the thing to remember about this thing. It is not about browser support. It's about standard support. And so when you talk about devices and smartphones, you're talking about the main ones are Android and iOS, and so obviously they're both WebKit. So they both support media queries really well. And then obviously Windows 7 is going to be moving to a better browser support, which will also support it. Hi, Michael. I didn't see you there. Yeah, so that's the main thing and I kept forgetting, and I remember again later on and go, oh, I don't have to. It's okay. So as long as we stick and say, people who are using, you have to take a few assumptions with this and say, if you are looking on a desktop, then chances are you won't be using on your device out in the wild using IE6. And when you're in your office, which forces you to IE6, then you're probably going to be on a desktop. So it's those types of things you have to take a few assumptions, otherwise you just go insane. Yeah. So,
I mean, yeah, it's a good point about support for media queries. Also kind of brings support for an awful lot of stuff. So, for example, where we were using media queries to realign things, and we needed to use, fairly advanced CSS3 selectors. Everything that supported media queries supported those selectors. So, so it was. We kept having these kind of revelations about, oh yeah, I can use that. I don't need to worry about that being supported in IE8, IE7 because IE8, IE7 isn't going to be like this. So, yeah.
How did you get that past the client then? They were forward-looking, and they were trusting in our approach, and they were really enthusiastic about looking ahead rather than, oh no, but we run IE6 in the office and we can't see it. And I think that was really cemented the first time we showed them the homepage and what it could do. And here's it on the phone, here's it on the iPad. They saw the potential, and they let us do what we thought was the best approach. So it was, all credit to McDonald's Hotels for having that vision. But I think if you wanted to make that argument for maybe a less visionary client, I think there is an awful lot of information, awful lot of statistics about where things are going, in terms of in terms of adoption of things like smartphones, in terms of the percentage usage versus desktop, and so on. I kind of look at the kind of explosion in mobile devices and the adoption as it's a wee bit like global warming, and that there's a massive amount of statistics to support it, but sometimes it's just a wee bit too big for people to get into their heads. But I think as more and more statistics come out about, and mobile use goes up and traditional desktop use goes down, and as companies, industry leaders like Facebook and Twitter and technology creators like Adobe are publicly saying we are absolutely embracing mobile, and we're doing mobile first. Mobile is our focus. Then I think those are powerful people to have in your corner in terms of making the argument to clients. I think where are we at? Just after 12. But any more? Any more for any more? Okay. Well, thanks again for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've got something out of the discussion. I certainly have. It's been really good. So thanks again. Thank you.